Slavery was already a crime against humanity. But what this Mississippi plantation owner did to his own children crossed a line even his era couldn't openly acknowledge. The summer of 1901 hung heavy over Wilkinson County, Mississippi, like a shroud draped across the delta. The air itself seemed to carry secrets, thick and suffocating, pressing down on the vast cotton fields that stretched toward horizons blurred by heat and history. Blackwood Manor stood at the end of a long drive lined with ancient oaks, their branches draped in Spanish moss that swayed like the ghosts of hanged men. The house was a monument to antebellum grandeur that had somehow survived the war and Reconstruction, though its white columns had yellowed with age and its gardens had grown wild in patches where the groundskeepers couldn't keep pace with nature's rebellion. Inside that house lived 3 sisters, Catherine, aged 23, Margaret, 21, and young Elizabeth, just 17. They moved through the halls like pale wraiths, always together, always watchful, their eyes carrying the weight of unspoken burdens. The servants whispered about them in the kitchen house, about how they never smiled, about how they flinched at sudden movements, about how they locked their bedroom doors at night. Their father, Colonel Josiah Blackwood, was a man of reputation in the county. He had inherited the plantation from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The war had reduced their holdings, but not eliminated them, and Josiah had clawed back some measure of prosperity through ruthless business practices and strategic marriages. 3 of them, each wife dying under circumstances that the local doctor attributed to various maladies, but that the black families who worked the land whispered about in more sinister terms. The last wife, the sister's mother, had died when Elizabeth was only 7. Since then, the girls had been alone with their father in that great house, isolated from town society by both distance and by Josiah's increasing paranoia and controlling nature. Catherine, the eldest, had once been engaged to a young lawyer from Natchez. The engagement had ended abruptly, and the lawyer had left Mississippi entirely. Margaret had been courted by a merchant's son until Josiah had run him off the property with a shotgun, claiming the boy was after the Blackwood fortune. Elizabeth had never been allowed to attend the socials where young women of her class might meet suitable men. They were prisoners in all but name, trapped by laws that gave fathers absolute authority over their unmarried daughters, trapped by a society that looked away from what happened behind the closed doors of respectable homes, trapped by their own fear and shame. But something was changing in the spring and summer of 1901. Anyone who paid attention might have noticed it. The way the sisters had begun meeting in whispered conferences, the way Catherine's eyes had taken on a harder glint, the way Margaret had started spending time in the library reading legal texts and old newspapers, the way young Elizabeth had begun carrying herself with a strange new confidence. The servants noticed, particularly 2 of them, Solomon, who had worked at Blackwood Manor since before the war, and his daughter Ruth, who served as the sisters' lady's maid. They noticed and they said nothing, but their silence was laden with hope. The crimes had begun so gradually that Catherine sometimes couldn't pinpoint exactly when her childhood had ended and the nightmare had begun. She remembered being 12, perhaps, when her father's embraces had started to last too long, when his hands had begun to wander where they shouldn't. She remembered being 13 when the late-night visits to her room had started, when she learned that screaming did no good because there was no one to hear, no one who would help. She was 14 when she understood that this was her life now, that her father's respectability in the daylight world existed alongside monstrous cruelty in the darkness. She was 15 when it started happening to Margaret. Catherine had tried to protect her younger sister. She had tried to take all of her father's attention, to bear the worst of it, so that Margaret might be spared. But Josiah Blackwood's appetite was limitless, his sense of entitlement absolute. He owned the land, he owned the house, and he believed he owned everyone in it, body and soul. The girls learned to disappear inside themselves during those visits. They learned to separate their minds from their bodies, to float somewhere above the horrible present moment. They learned to wash themselves raw in cold water afterward, though no amount of scrubbing could ever make them feel clean. They learned to lie with dead eyes to the doctor when he came for his occasional visits. They learned to maintain perfect composure in church, sitting in the family pew while the minister preached about sin and virtue. They learned that the world would not save them, that their suffering would remain invisible as long as they maintained the proper appearances. When Elizabeth turned 13, Catherine knew what was coming. She and Margaret tried everything to prevent it. They attempted to keep Elizabeth always in their company, never alone. But Josiah was patient and powerful. He waited for his opportunities, and he always found them. The day it first happened to Elizabeth, the youngest sister stumbled into the room Catherine and Margaret shared, her nightgown torn, her face blank with shock. Catherine held her while Margaret wept silent tears of rage and helplessness. That night, for the first time, the three sisters spoke openly about what their father had done, what he continued to do, what he would keep doing until one of them died or found escape. "We could run away," Margaret whispered. "Where?" Catherine asked bitterly. "He would find us. The law gives him that right. We are his property until we marry, and he will never allow us to marry." "We could tell someone," Elizabeth said, her voice small and broken. "Who would believe us?" Margaret replied. "And if they did believe us, they would blame us. We would be ruined, and he would suffer nothing." They fell silent, holding each other in the darkness, three sisters who had been robbed of everything except each other. But in that silence, something new was born. A spark of fury that refused to be extinguished, a determination that there had to be a way out, even if they had to create it themselves. Catherine began to change after that night. The eldest sister had always been the most pragmatic, the most willing to endure for the sake of survival. But Elizabeth's initiation into their father's abuse had broken something inside Catherine, some last vestige of hope that things might somehow improve, that their father might somehow change. If there was no hope for mercy, then there was no reason to wait for rescue that would never come. She started paying closer attention to everything. She watched how her father moved through his days, noting his patterns and habits. She observed which servants he trusted and which he dismissed. She studied the locked drawer in his desk, where he kept his important papers, and the small pistol he sometimes carried. Margaret, with her love of reading, spent hours in the library that their father rarely entered. She read law books, trying to understand what rights they had, precious few, and what circumstances might free them. She read newspaper accounts of trials, studying cases where women had been accused of crimes, noting which defenses had succeeded and which had failed. She also read about poisons. The library contained their grandfather's collection of botanical texts, filled with detailed descriptions of the plants that grew throughout Mississippi. Some of those plants were highly toxic. Margaret took careful notes, copying information about symptoms, dosages, and effects. She hid these notes in a hollowed-out book of poetry that their father would never think to open. Elizabeth, the youngest, became their spy and messenger. She cultivated relationships with the servants, particularly Ruth, who had always been kind to them. She learned the schedules of everyone who worked at Blackwood Manor. She discovered which servants had their own reasons to hate Josiah Blackwood, and there were many. The sisters were careful never to speak openly of their plans, even to each other. They communicated in fragments, in coded phrases, in meaningful glances. They knew that their father sometimes listened at doors, that he had informants among the household staff, that paranoia was a survival skill they couldn't afford to abandon. But slowly, carefully, a plan began to take shape. June brought oppressive heat and violent thunderstorms that rolled across the delta with apocalyptic fury. The cotton plants struggled in the wet fields, and Josiah Blackwood's mood grew darker as he worried about the harvest and his mounting debts. He had always been a heavy drinker, but that summer he began drinking earlier in the day and more heavily at night. The whiskey made him more volatile, more violent, more dangerous. The sisters bore fresh bruises that they carefully concealed beneath their long sleeves and high collars. One particularly brutal night in late June, after Josiah had visited first Catherine and then Margaret, leaving both sisters bruised and bleeding, they made their final decision. There would be no more waiting, no more hoping, no more enduring. They would kill him. The decision once made brought a strange kind of peace. They moved through the following days with eerie calm, perfecting their preparations. Margaret had identified white snake root as their weapon of choice. The plant grew wild in the shaded areas near the creek, and its toxin, tremetol, was deadly but slow-acting. Death would appear to come from natural causes: weakness, tremors, difficulty breathing. The local doctor, who was elderly and not particularly attentive, would likely diagnose it as a summer fever or heart failure. Catherine used her access to the kitchen to begin adding small amounts of the poison to Josiah's evening whiskey. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to begin weakening him, making him sick enough that his eventual death would seem like the culmination of an illness. Elizabeth kept watch, monitoring which servants were where, making sure no one saw anything suspicious. She also cultivated an alibi, making sure the sisters were seen together in innocent activities, often with witnesses who could later testify to their whereabouts and their apparently normal behavior. But they needed more than poison. They needed insurance, evidence that would protect them if anyone suspected foul play. They needed the truth about their father's crimes to be documented, ready to be revealed if necessary. Margaret began keeping a detailed journal, recording dates, times, and descriptions of their father's assaults. She wrote in careful, clinical language, knowing that hysteria would undermine credibility. She hid the journal in a waterproof bag buried beneath a loose board in the stable, where Ruth knew to find it if the sisters were ever arrested. Catherine visited Solomon, the elderly black man who had served the Blackwood family his entire life. She spoke to him privately, in the garden where they could not be overheard. She told him everything, not asking for his help, but giving him information, trusting him with the truth. Solomon listened with tears streaming down his weathered face. When Catherine finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I seen it, Miss Catherine. All of us seen it one way or another. We just didn't know what to do. The law ain't for people like us to use against people like your father." "The law isn't for people like us either," Catherine replied quietly. "My father's rights extend over us, absolutely. We have no legal recourse, no protection. We are doing what we must to survive." Solomon nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "If anything happens to us, I need you to make sure that journal is found. I need you to tell the truth if anyone asks. But only if we fail. If we succeed, take the journal and burn it. Let our shame die with him." "You won't fail," Solomon said with quiet certainty. "God don't protect devils forever." Josiah Blackwood fell ill in early July. At first it seemed like a summer complaint. Nausea, weakness, a slight tremor in his hands. The doctor prescribed rest and bland foods. Josiah, irritable and suspicious by nature, accused the cook of trying to poison him and demanded that his daughters prepare his meals personally. This suited the sisters perfectly. Catherine took over her father's meals with apparent dutiful concern. She brought him breakfast in bed, prepared his midday dinner, and served his evening supper with her own hands. She administered the tinctures the doctor prescribed. She also administered Margaret's poison, measured in precisely calculated doses. Josiah grew weaker. The tremors worsened. He developed difficulty breathing and complained of chest pains. His paranoia intensified. He accused servants of stealing from him, neighbors of plotting against him, his own daughters of neglecting him. "You want me to die," he whispered to Catherine one evening, his hand clamping around her wrist with surprising strength for a dying man. "You ungrateful creatures. I gave you everything. I could have cast you out after your mother died, but I kept you. I provided for you." "Yes, Father," Catherine said, her voice carefully neutral. "You gave us everything." He stared at her with rheumy eyes, trying to read meaning into her words, but finding none. He released her wrist and demanded more whiskey. As July wore on, Josiah became bedridden. The doctor visited more frequently, shaking his head in concern, but offering no real diagnosis beyond a weakening of the constitution and perhaps the heat. The servants whispered that it was divine judgment. The few neighbors who called to inquire were told that the colonel was gravely ill and receiving no visitors. The sisters maintained their vigil, playing their roles perfectly. They appeared worried, dutiful, devoted. They took turns sitting with their father through the long hours. They read to him from the Bible. They brought him what little food and drink he could keep down, and they waited. On July the 28th, 1901, as another thunderstorm rolled across the delta, Colonel Josiah Blackwood died. His daughters were at his bedside. They did not weep. The funeral was held 3 days later, on a scorching August afternoon. Half the county attended, drawn by the Blackwood name, if not by any particular affection for the deceased. The minister eulogized Josiah as a pillar of the community, a man who had served with distinction in the war, a devoted father who had raised 3 daughters alone after his wife's tragic death. Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth stood by the graveside in their black mourning clothes, their faces properly somber, their eyes dry. They accepted condolences from neighbors who had never once intervened, from the doctor who had never asked the right questions, from the minister who had preached weakly about sin while their father committed abominations. After the burial, people returned to Blackwood Manor for the customary gathering. The sisters moved through the rooms of their house, serving refreshments, accepting sympathies, playing the role of bereaved daughters with perfect composure. "Such a tragedy," one matron said to Catherine, "to lose your father while you're still unwed. What will you girls do?" "We will manage," Catherine replied evenly. "My father left affairs in good order." This was not entirely true. When the lawyers read Josiah's will, the sisters discovered that their father had left the plantation to them jointly, but with significant debts attached. There were mortgages, unpaid loans, obligations to creditors. The estate was not worthless, but it was encumbered. Most young women in their situation would have panicked. Most would have sought immediately to marry, to find a man to take control of their inheritance and their lives. The Blackwood sisters did not panic, and they did not seek husbands. Instead, they called a meeting with their father's lawyer, his banker, and his creditors. They came prepared with documents, with proposals, with a clear plan for managing the estate and paying off the debts. Margaret, who had studied law in the library, proved surprisingly adept at negotiating terms. Catherine, who had run the household for years, demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of the plantation's operations. Even young Elizabeth contributed, having memorized details about crop yields and market prices. The men in that meeting were initially condescending, addressing their remarks to each other rather than to the sisters. But as the hours wore on, they began to recognize that these young women were not helpless ornaments waiting to be rescued. They were intelligent, determined, and surprisingly well-informed. Within a month, the sisters had renegotiated their father's debts on more favorable terms, sold off some peripheral lands to raise capital, and began implementing changes to the plantation's operations that would improve efficiency and profitability. They also began making other changes. The first thing the sisters did was call Solomon to the main house. They sat him down in the parlor, the same parlor where their father had entertained his cronies, where respectable white society had gathered to drink whiskey and discuss the natural order of things. "Solomon," Catherine said, "we want to pay you wages for your work, real wages, not just room and board. And we want to draw up a contract that gives you a share of the crop profits." Solomon stared at them. "Miss Catherine, that ain't... People don't do that." "People should do that," Margaret said firmly. "You've worked this land your entire life. You know it better than we do. You deserve compensation for your knowledge and your labor." They made the same offer to Solomon's daughter Ruth, to the cook, to every person who worked at Blackwood Manor. They couldn't undo decades of injustice, couldn't erase the stain of slavery and its aftermath. But they could at least treat people as human beings deserving of fair compensation. Some of the neighboring planters were scandalized. Some suggested that the Blackwood sisters were dangerously progressive, that they were upsetting the social order, that they needed male guidance to keep them from radical mistakes. The sisters ignored them. They also began quietly reaching out to other young women in the county, particularly those who seemed isolated or fearful. They invited them to tea, created opportunities for social connection, offered refuge if needed. They never spoke explicitly about their own experiences, but somehow, certain women seemed to understand that Blackwood Manor had become a safe place, a place where women looked out for each other. Elizabeth, freed from her father's control, began attending the normal social functions appropriate to her age and class. She was courted by several young men, but she chose carefully, waiting until she found someone who treated her with respect and kindness. When she married, 2 years after her father's death, It was to a schoolteacher from Vicksburg, a gentleman who never raised his voice and who supported his wife's desire to continue living near her sisters. Margaret never married. She studied law informally, learning everything she could despite being barred from formal legal education or practice. She became an informal advocate for women in the county who needed help with contracts, property disputes, or estate issues. Lawyers and judges found her surprisingly formidable despite her lack of official credentials. Catherine also remained unmarried. She focused on running the plantation, and under her management, it slowly prospered. She was tough in business dealings, unforgiving of those who tried to cheat her, but fair to those who dealt honestly. The creditors who had thought to take advantage of inexperienced women found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The three sisters lived together at Blackwood Manor for the rest of their lives, creating a household that operated on their terms, by their rules. It was not a perfect life. They carried scars that never fully healed, but it was their life, lived in freedom. No one ever suspected that Josiah Blackwood had been murdered. His death was attributed to natural causes, a consequence of age and the summer heat. The doctor signed the death certificate without hesitation. The few people who might have had suspicions kept them to themselves, either because they had no proof or because they felt the colonel had gotten what he deserved. Margaret's journal remained hidden beneath the stable floor for 5 years. Then, one night, she dug it up, read through it one final time, and burned it page by page in the fireplace while her sisters watched. "Should we feel guilty?" Elizabeth asked quietly as they watched the pages turn to ash. "Do you?" Catherine replied. Elizabeth considered. "No, I feel free." "Then that's your answer," Margaret said. The three sisters never spoke of what they had done, not even to each other in their most private moments. Some secrets were too dangerous to voice, even decades later. But they lived with their decision without regret, secure in the knowledge that they had done what was necessary to survive, to escape, to claim the lives that should have been theirs from the beginning. Solomon kept their secret as well. When he died in 1915, he was buried in the small cemetery on Blackwood land that the sisters had set aside for their employees. His gravestone was simple but respectful. His daughter Ruth continued working at Blackwood Manor until her own death in 1932, always refusing offers of easier positions elsewhere, loyal to the women who had treated her with dignity. Catherine Blackwood died in 1941 at the age of 63. Margaret followed in 1947 at 67. Elizabeth, the youngest, lived until 1955, passing away at the age of 71. They left the plantation to Elizabeth's children, along with a trust fund to support the descendants of those who had worked the land. Their wills contained careful provisions, ensuring that the property could never be sold except under specific circumstances, and that certain parcels would be deeded permanently to the families who had lived and worked there for generations. In their private papers, discovered after Elizabeth's death, there was a single sealed letter addressed to those who come after. It contained no confession, no detailed account of crimes committed or justified. Instead, it contained advice. To our descendants and to all young women who may read this, the world will not protect you simply because you deserve protection. Laws will not save you simply because you deserve justice. Society will not intervene simply because you are suffering. You must protect yourselves. You must save yourselves. You must be brave enough to do what is necessary, even when it is difficult, even when it is frightening, even when the world would condemn you for it. We lived in a time when women had almost no legal rights, no recourse against the men who controlled our lives. You live in a different time with different laws and different options. Use them. Fight for yourselves and for each other. And remember, survival is not shameful. Survival is victory. Whatever you must do to achieve it, do so without apology and without regret. We survived. We lived. We made our lives mean something beyond our suffering. That is enough. That is everything. The letter was signed by all three sisters, dated 1940, composed when they were all elderly women, looking back on the choices they had made 4 decades earlier. It remains in the family archives, a testament to women who refused to be victims, who took power when it would not be given, who created justice when the law offered none. The true story of what happened at Blackwood Manor in the summer of 1901 died with the sisters, and with Solomon and Ruth. But the legacy of that summer, the determination, the courage, the refusal to accept cruelty as inevitable, that legacy lived on. And sometimes, in certain lights, visitors to what remains of Blackwood Manor say they can feel something in the air, not sadness or horror, but a fierce, triumphant sense of freedom, hard won and dearly kept. The dead keep their secrets, but the living remember what matters, that 3 sisters survived, that they claimed their lives back from the man who sought to destroy them, and that they lived those lives on their own terms until the very end. That is the true history of Blackwood Manor. That is the story that needed to be told. This story is a work of fiction inspired by historical circumstances. While the specific events and characters are invented, they reflect the very real horror experienced by countless women and girls throughout history, who suffered abuse in situations where the law provided no protection and society offered no refuge. The methods by which the Blackwood sisters achieved their freedom should not be emulated, but their courage and determination to survive deserve recognition. Their story is a reminder that the rights and protections women have today were won through struggle and must be vigilantly defended.